Biomed Nexus. Daily updates. Your essential biotech, medtech, and pharma recap. No noise, just what matters. TLDR, the FDA approved GSK's zidesamtinib for ROS1 positive lung cancer, the first approval to come out of its $10, 6B Nuvalent acquisition and GSK's first ever lung cancer product. We flagged Monday that this program had to carry the load. It delivered in 3 days. J&J posted a striking myeloma readout with Tecvayli and Talvey showing an 89% improvement in progression-free survival and a 62% overall survival benefit in earlier treatment. AstraZeneca's camizestrant won a positive European opinion weeks after a US advisory panel voted against it, setting up a transatlantic split on the same breast cancer data. Trump set a countdown on generic drug tariffs, ending the exemption that has shielded the copycat medicines behind most US prescriptions and framing the levies as a penalty for not reshoring. Biopharma layoffs would have to double in the second half of 2026 to match last year's cuts, a real sign the labor bleeding has slowed. Executive takeaway. On Monday we wrote that GSK's habit of cutting losing programs fast, camlipixant in chronic cough, and the Electa Neuropact before it was defensible discipline that came with a cost. Fewer shots on goal means more weight on each remaining one, and we said the Nuvalent lung cancer drugs now had to carry the load. 3 days later, they started to. The FDA approved Gidatro, known in development as zidesamtinib, for patients with ROS1 positive non-small cell lung cancer who have already received a ROS1 inhibitor. It is the first approval to come out of the $10. 6B Nuvalent acquisition, GSK's largest deal in a decade, and remarkably, it is GSK's first approved lung cancer product ever. For a company that has been criticized for a thin oncology position, entering lung cancer through the front door with a targeted therapy is a real strategic shift. Neladalkib, the ALK drug from the same deal, is still pending. If it lands too, the Nuvalent thesis is validated faster than anyone expected, and Luke Mills gets to point at a deal that paid off inside a year. Now the week's thread, which we set Monday around Q2 earnings, and what they would reveal about the sector's real health. The picture that emerged is healthy but uneven, and the labor data may be the cleanest evidence yet. J&J opened the season soft with an oncology miss. Novartis came in steady at 3% growth with guidance reaffirmed. And this week, we learned that biopharma layoffs would need to double in the second half just to match 2025's total. After 2 years, in which the sector shed workers relentlessly, fewer companies are cutting. That is a more honest signal of underlying health than any single quarter's revenue line, because companies do not stop cutting until they believe the outlook justifies keeping people. Put it together, and the read we have carried all month holds. The industry is genuinely healthier, the strength is uneven across franchises, and the flush conditions at the top still sit above an early-stage funding drought nobody wants to headline. Watch the remaining earnings next week for whether the oncology softness at J&J was idiosyncratic or the start of a pattern. Read full analysis. Oncology GSK's biggest deal in a decade produced an approval and its first lung cancer drug. GSK, the FDA approved GSK's Gidatro, zidesamtinib, for adults with locally advanced or metastatic ROS1 positive non-small cell lung cancer who have received a prior ROS1 kinase inhibitor, according to the Pharma Letter and Biospace. It is GSK's first approved product in lung cancer, and it arrives from the $10. 6B Nuvalent takeover that closed last month, the company's largest acquisition in a decade, and the signature move of CEO Luke Mills. ROS1 rearrangements drive a small but meaningful share of lung cancers, and patients who progress on a first ROS1 inhibitor have had limited options, making the previously treated setting a logical entry point. Biospace noted that between Nuvalent and a 2023 Hansoh deal, GSK now has several other lung cancer assets in late-stage development. Neladalkib, the ALK inhibitor from the same acquisition, remains under review. 2 approvals inside a year of closing would make Nuvalent one of the fastest-paying large acquisitions in recent memory. J&J's bispecific combination delivered a big number in earlier myeloma. J&J reported top-line results from the Monumental-6 study showing its bispecific antibodies, Tecvayli and Talvey, produced an 89% improvement in progression-free survival and a 62% overall survival benefit in earlier lines of multiple myeloma treatment, according to Fierce Pharma. Moving bispecific antibodies from late-line salvage into earlier treatment is the strategic direction for the whole class, because the patient populations are larger and the disease is more treatable. Numbers of this magnitude, if they hold in the full data set, would strengthen the case for using these drugs before patients exhaust other options. It is also a welcome result for J&J in oncology the same month its oncology sales missed expectations. Regulatory Europe said yes to a breast cancer drug America's advisors said no to. AstraZeneca's camizestrant won a positive opinion from Europe's CHMP less than a month after a US advisory panel voted against it, according to the Pharma letter, creating a striking transatlantic split over the same breast cancer data. Divergent regulatory outcomes on identical evidence are uncommon and always instructive. They usually reflect different weightings of the same trade-offs, how much benefit is enough, how much toxicity is acceptable, and what the available alternatives look like in each market. For AstraZeneca, a European path forward softens the blow of the US panel vote, though the FDA has not yet issued its own decision and is not bound by its advisors. For the broader industry, it is a reminder that a negative AdCom is a setback rather than a verdict, and that a drug's commercial life can look very different on either side of the Atlantic. Policy: the generic tariff countdown is now official, and the framing is explicitly punitive. President Trump set a countdown for tariffs on imported generic medicines, ending an exemption that had shielded the copycat drugs behind the bulk of U.S. prescriptions, according to the Pharma letter. Announcing the plan on Truth Social, he framed the levies as a penalty for companies that decline to shift production onto American soil. That framing matters. It positions the tariff as leverage rather than revenue, which supports the read we gave yesterday. This is an attempt to force relocation decisions after the private appeals from Rubio, Kennedy, and Klomp earlier this month did not move anyone. Indian pharmaceutical stocks fell sharply when the plan surfaced, which tells you where the exposure sits. The unresolved problem is unchanged. Generic economics are brutal, margins are thin, and a tariff raises import costs without making domestic production profitable. Relatedly, India's Lupin moved 2 of its cancer development programs into a newly formed US-based biotech, one early example of how Indian companies may respond. The Section 232 pharma tariffs take effect for large companies a week from today. The business, the clearest sign the sector turned, is that companies stopped cutting people. Pharma layoffs would have to double in the second half for 2026 to match 2025's total, according to Biospace, with fewer companies making or planning workforce reductions year over year. That is a meaningful marker. Layoffs are a lagging indicator of confidence, and companies do not stop cutting until leadership believes the outlook justifies carrying the headcount. After the brutal 2024 and 2025 stretch, the slowdown we first flagged in early July is holding. It is not uniform. Clinuvel is cutting up to 1/5 of its staff as it relocates its headquarters to the US, and Novartis shed 322 workers. Individual restructurings continue even as the aggregate improves. That unevenness is the through line of this whole earnings season. J&J soft on oncology, Novartis steady with guidance, reaffirmed. The labor market healing, but not everywhere at once. The sector is genuinely better than it was a year ago. It is not uniformly good, and the early-stage funding drought still sits underneath the strong headline numbers. The week in review Monday, IgA nephropathy, turned into a three-way race as Novartis won full approval for Fabhalta. J&J opened earnings soft. GSK killed camlipixant. Tuesday, Lilly's tally hit 11 acquisitions this year, by far the most in pharma. Late July binary readouts came into view. Wednesday, Novo sued Lilly in federal court over GLP-1 advertising. Novartis posted 3% growth and reaffirmed guidance. Thursday, Trump announced generic drug tariffs for 2028, and Indian pharma stocks fell. Pharma began lobbying to narrow the China restrictions. Samsung Biologics and Repligen struck 2 tools deals in a day. Friday, GSK's Nuvalent bet produced its first approval. J&J posted a big myeloma readout. Camizestrant split the regulators. Red, full analysis. Biomed, Nexus Pro institutional intelligence brief. The Nuvalent deal is working, and neladalkib decides how well when GSK paid $10.6b for Nuvalent in June. It was the company's largest acquisition in a decade and a defining bet for Luke Meals. The thesis was straightforward. Buy 2 late-stage targeted lung cancer drugs, zidesamtinib for ROS1 and neladalkib for ALK, and use them to build the oncology position GSK has long lacked. Both were already under FDA review at the time of the deal, which is precisely why GSK paid a premium. It was buying near-term approvals, not science. The first one landed, Judetro is approved, and it gives GSK its first ever lung cancer product. That is a genuine strategic milestone for a company whose oncology franchise has been thin relative to peers. The previously treated ROS1 setting is a defined niche rather than a blockbuster market on its own, but it establishes GSK with lung cancer prescribers and creates a platform to build on, particularly alongside the Hansoh assets in late-stage development. Neladalkib is the bigger prize. The ALK-positive population is larger than ROS1, and the competitive field includes established drugs, so the commercial opportunity and the bar to clear are both higher. An approval there would validate the full Nuvalent thesis inside a year of closing, which would be exceptionally fast for a deal of this size and would put real weight behind Meals' strategy of buying de-risked assets rather than betting on early science. This also reframes the fast-cutting we questioned Monday. Killing camlipixant and walking from Alecta left GSK with fewer shots on goal, and we flagged that as concentration risk. The zidesamtinib approval suggests the offsetting logic works. Cut the programs whose data disappoint and redeploy toward assets that are already de-risked enough to reach the market quickly. That is a coherent capital allocation philosophy rather than a company retreating. Watch neladalkib for the confirmation, and watch whether GSK's next moves follow the same pattern of buying late stage rather than building early. When regulators split on the same data, camizestrant getting a positive CHMP opinion weeks after a negative US advisory vote is worth understanding, because these divergences carry information for anyone modeling regulatory risk. Advisory committees and regulators are weighing the same evidence against different frameworks. The FDA's advisors may focus on whether the magnitude of benefit justifies the toxicity in the context of the US treatment landscape, where certain alternatives are widely used. European reviewers may weight the same trade-off differently based on what is available and reimbursed there, on how the endpoints map to European clinical practice, or simply on a different institutional tolerance for uncertainty when the unmet need is meaningful. 3 practical implications. First, a negative advisory vote is not a decision. The FDA is not bound by its advisors and has gone against them before, so camizestrant still has a US path, even if it is now harder. Second, geographic divergence is a real commercial scenario worth planning for. and companies increasingly build launch strategies that assume different timing or labels by region. Third, for investors, a negative AdCom often overcorrects a stock precisely because the market treats it as final when it is not. For AstraZeneca specifically, the European opinion provides a meaningful commercial path and takes some pressure off a moment when the company is absorbing the Wainua failure and, per Biospace, seeing its route to an $80 revenue goal narrow ahead of more high-risk readouts. Camizestrant will not fix that alone, but a positive European outcome on a drug the US panel doubted is a better position than it looked like a month ago. What the layoff slowdown actually tells us: of everything we saw this week, the layoff data may be the most reliable signal about sector health, and it is worth explaining why. Revenue in a given quarter reflects decisions made years ago, product cycles, and one-time items. Deal announcements reflect the ambitions of a handful of large buyers. Layoffs reflect something different, what management teams across hundreds of companies believe about their own futures right now. Cutting people is expensive, damaging to morale, and hard to reverse. Companies do it when they are convinced they have to. When cutting slows broadly, it means confidence has genuinely returned across the sector, not just at the top. The finding that layoffs would need to double in the second half to match 2025 is therefore a strong statement. It says the wave that defined the past 2 years has broken. Combined with the reopened IPO window, the record M&A, and the friendlier regulatory posture, the case for a real recovery is now supported by multiple independent indicators rather than sentiment alone. The caveats keep us honest. Clinuvel cutting a fifth of its staff and Novartis shedding 322 workers show individual restructurings continue. M&A itself eliminates roles, so the consolidation wave will produce cuts even in a healthy market. And the early-stage funding drought we have flagged repeatedly means the smallest companies are still under real pressure, even as the aggregate improves. Our read heading into the second half: the recovery is real and broad enough to trust. The unevenness across franchises and company sizes is the thing to watch, and the risk that actually matters is not this year's numbers, but the thin, early-stage pipeline that will show up as a shortage of acquisition targets in the 2030s. Enjoy the good quarter. Keep an eye on the seed corn. Catalyst calendar, date, event, tickers. Next week, Q2 earnings continue for Big Pharma multiple late. July BMS CAR XT Alzheimer's, Psychosis readout BMY late, July PTC, CP Uptirin, PKU readout PTCT July, 31 section, 232 pharma tariffs, effective, large companies. Multiple August 2026 Replimune RP1 FDA response, Repl August 22 Capricorn, Deramiocel PDUFA AdCom pending, Cap Priminent Revolution. Medicines, CNPV filing RVM Diminent Lilly, Foundayo T2D filing, under CNPVLI ongoing biotech. Investment National Security Act, awaits committee vote multiple 2026 Niladalkib, FDA decision, ALK NSCLC GSK 3 2026 Revolution. Darexon Resib approval projected, Truist, RVMDQ3 2026 Unicuri, Huntington's gene therapy, under review correct 3 2026 Regan XBO, Duchenne gene therapy, BLA filing RGNXQ3 2026 ABVIE Apogee, Vertex, Crinetics, Ipsen. Deals, close expected multiple Q3 2026 Merck, KGaA, Biotechny, close expected MKKGY SFT, OCT Celldex, Barzolvolimab, Phase 3 Chronic Hives, Data CLDX SFT, 19 Ultragenics, UX111 PDUFA, Sanfilippo, Type A, Rarecept, 29 Section, 230T, Pharma Tariffs Effective, All Others, Multiple H2, 2026 Merck, SAC TMT, Global Filings, expected MRKH2 2026 Foundeo, T2D Regulatory Action expected LLY Novi Bartin Summit, Ibonesumab, FDA Decision, NSCLC, SMMT and OV30 Vertex, Pobetacitept, PDUFA, IgA, Nephropathy, BRTXD 2026, Mineralis, Lorundrostat, PDUFAM, Lice 1026, Triumph PH2 and Triumph PH3 readouts, Retatrutide, LLY DEC, 7 Lilly. Investment Community Meeting, LLY 2027 Retatrutide launch, anticipated, BMO. July 2008, generic drug tariffs take effect. Multiple GSK's biggest deal in a decade delivered an approval, and the company's first lung cancer drug. Europe and the US split on the same breast cancer data. And the clearest sign the sector turned is that companies stopped cutting people. Have a good weekend. What are you watching? Reply to this email. Visit the Pro Hub Read. Full article sponsorship slots for 2026 are limited. See packages and pricing. New Biomed Nexus signals. Weekly sales intelligence for life sciences BD teams. Learn more.